Hi there, and welcome to the Apiary, a knitting podcast. If we haven't met before, my name is Lauren Rad, and I design knitting patterns. I focus on accessories, primarily socks, but also shawls, as you can see, and hats and fingerless mitts and whatever else strikes my fancy, except for garments, because those give me a headache. Today I'm going to be answering all of the many questions I've gotten over the years about the mitered square blanket of doom. And if you don't know what the mitered square blanket of doom is, let me show you. This is the mitered square blanket of doom. This is a massive project that I worked on over the course of 3 years. I have a lot of numbers to share with you, a lot of details to share with you about it. I do also have a free tutorial on my blog if you want to knit your own mitered square blanket, so I will drop the link to that down in the description below. All right, so let's get into the numbers. And even though I have not practiced law since 2018, I still have a whole bunch of handy dandy yellow legal pads around the house. So that's where I kept track of everything. All right, this mitered square blanket has 273 total squares in it. Each of those squares took about 45 minutes, approximately. Some were a little faster, some were a little slower. And so I spent approximately 205 hours knitting this blanket. Then I had to weave in all of the ends. And I did pause to do that periodically. I'd kind of let the ends build up for, 3 or 4 rows and then weave in a whole bunch of them at once. But I calculated how long it took me to weave in one set of ends and then multiplied that by how many ends there were in the blanket. And that came out to an additional 8.6 hours of weaving in ends. Yeah, that's rounded to the nearest tenth of an hour. All told, that means somewhere between 213 to 214 hours worth of knitting and weaving in ends on this beast of a blanket. The blanket used 1,800 grams or about 4 pounds of yarn, which comes out to about 18 skeins of fingering weight yarn. Now I did hold that yarn double, more on that in a little bit. This is almost exclusively indie hand-dyed yarn because it is leftovers from sock projects for me, but if I had to pay for those, a skein of indie hand-dyed sock yarn runs usually between about $28 to $33, $34 a skein. So we're looking at about $550 to $600 worth of yarn. For ease of calculation, I just kind of split the difference and said $575 of yarn. Now remember, within the range of yarn weights, there is varying thickness, and so a single 100-gram skein of fingering weight yarn might have anywhere from about 380 to maybe 450 yards worth of yarn. I settled on an average of about 400 yards worth of yarn. That's the most common. I usually see 400 to 420-ish is the most common amount of yardage per skein. This blanket has roughly 7,200 yards worth of yarn in it. Now here's where it gets really fun. If I wanted to try and calculate the value of the labor that I put into this blanket, whew. Now again, just for ease of calculation, I went with minimum wage in my home state of California, which at the time I started this blanket was $14 an hour for very small businesses. There was a period of time there where minimum wage in California was on a 2-tier system depending on how large the business is. Now we are back into just a single minimum wage across the whole state. So if I use the $14 an hour from 2022, because I am a very small business, it's just me, that would be about $2,100 worth of labor. When I finished the blanket in December of 2025, the minimum wage was $16.50 an hour. So at that rate, it would have been about $3,500 worth of labor. So calculating based on my labor and based on the cost of the yarn, if I had to buy it, a rough price for this blanket would be somewhere between $2,695 and $4,075. Now, of course, there are all sorts of things in here that we could quibble about. One is that my labor is not minimum wage labor. This is very, very good work. I'm not going to be falsely modest here and say that I'm not a very good knitter. No, I am a good knitter. So it would be valued at higher than minimum wage. You could also quibble about all of the other costs involved in running a business. There are all sorts of overhead things that I have not included in these calculations, but this is just an attempt to get a rough calculation of a price point for this blanket, because I think a lot of people are not really aware of just how much goes into making hand knit goods. And so every now and then I like to do these sorts of calculations for them. The other thing we can quibble about as hand makers is that you can't really put a price on our finished projects, right? So, on the one hand, you have 4 pounds of yarn here and 214 hours worth of work. On the other hand, in this blanket, you have 3 years of memories. You have all of the family gatherings where I have been knitting this blanket. You have the trips that I have brought it on in baskets and all of the fun adventures that this blanket and I have had. You have all of the pairs of socks that are commemorated in the squares of this blanket, because again, this is all leftovers. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit. But there's a lot in here that you simply cannot quantify with a dollar value. This is one of my most treasured possessions. As I said in another video, if the house were on fire and I had made sure everybody was out safely, this would be one of the things I would grab if I could. Now let's answer some of the other frequent questions that I got involving this blanket as I was working on it over the years. The one thing people asked me about the most was the yarn itself. I got a lot of questions about whether I was using the same yarn for the whole blanket, what kind of yarn I was using, what thickness of yarn, where I got it from. So let's cover all of that. As I mentioned before, almost all of this is knit with yarn left over from projects that I have knit over the years. In fact, see that green? Ta-da! So occasionally you'll have leftovers from shawls too, but I like to knit shawls with sock yarn. So it's yarn I would have used for socks. Anyway, the interesting thing about this is that I started this blanket as a way to use up leftovers. Now, I tend to knit socks using 100 gram skeins of yarn, but I usually only need about 65 to 70 grams of that skein of yarn, which means for every pair of socks I knit, I've got about 30 grams of yarn left over. So I had these leftovers piling up in my leftover basket. And so I started knitting this blanket to use up those leftovers. The thing is, I was also running my design business at the same time that I was knitting this blanket. And so sometimes I would have to set the blanket aside to work on another pattern. And that pattern was frequently another pair of socks. And then I'd finish the pair of socks and pop that leftover yarn into the basket. What ended up happening is that I couldn't use up my scraps any faster than I could contribute new scraps to the basket. And so at the end of the project, I think I have about the same amount of scraps as I had when I started, if not a little bit more. Now, if you're not also running a design business alongside knitting your mitered square blanket, you will probably be able to actually make a dent in your stash. So don't let my experience discourage you. But I did think that was a kind of funny outcome that I did not anticipate. Now, more about the characteristics of this yarn. Because this is all leftovers, this is absolutely not the same yarn in every square. I did not use the same bases. Some of it's superwash, some of it's non-superwash, some of it's pure wool, some of it has up to 20% nylon mixed in. One even has a little bit of stellina for some sparkles in it, and a few of them have a little bit of cashmere mixed in because we're fancy over here. A lot of people wanted to know about how I got the colors to blend together so well and whether I picked the colors ahead of time. I didn't really. I did sift out the occasional color that I knew would not match. So for example, there's a really vibrant, deep forest green that is not in here, that's sitting in my basket and is going to be used for something else. There are a couple of really strong corals that I just could not soften up enough. But otherwise, I just kind of went with what I had because my design palette already has a fairly cohesive aesthetic. I tend to choose neutrals and soft pastels for my projects. And so they already kind of all go together. Another question I got frequently was questions about the needles I was using. So these are the needles I used for the whole blanket. This is a pair of Addy needles. These are US size 6 or 4 millimeter. You can see they are circular needles. I bought this pair of needles in 2009. That's right. I have had these needles for almost 17 years. And this is why I'm such a big proponent of buying nice tools that you know you love and that you're going to use for a long time. Because I spent the money on these needles once, 17 years ago. Now, have I bought other needles since then? Absolutely. I am not using one pair of size 6 needles for everything. But this pair of needles gets heavy use all the time. Now, I did get some questions about why I was using circular needles rather than straight needles, and there are a few reasons for that. One is I knit almost everything on circular needles, and I can do a separate video on why I prefer circular needles for all of my projects. But two of the big reasons for this project for why I was using circular needles are, one, I like the way the circular needles allow for the weight of my project to be distributed on the cord between the needle tips. And two, the shape of the squares when they first get started. So what happened here is I was joining my squares as I went. Let's get back to the cast on edge. And so I would finish this square, and then this square here would be empty. And so I'd pick up down along this line and pick up stitches along this line. And so I would have a sharp right angle that I was knitting into and then decreasing along it. Oh, actually, this is upside down. I was picking up and then decreasing along this way. So, but either way, you get the point. I had this sharp right angle that I was working in. And if I had to stretch that out across a straight needle, that would be kind of annoying. But I had the cord between my needle tips. And so that allowed me to kind of help curve my stitches more comfortably as I was working on them. Now that brings us to another question I got pretty frequently, which was, how did I join the squares? And I made this easy on myself by not seaming the squares. I cast on the first square, and then I picked up stitches along the side and knit the next square. Picked up stitches along the side and knit the next square. And then on the next row, I cast on some stitches, picked up stitches along the top, and then picked up stitches along the L, and picked up stitches along the L. And I kept going and I kept going. So all of the squares here were joined together as I knit. There is no seaming in this blanket. Now I did have the loose ends, again, those tails that I needed to weave in from all of the different color changes, but I did not have to sew any seams. If you have already knit a bunch of mitered squares that you now need to join together, I would recommend using the mattress stitch. That's a great way to have a nice invisible seam. So you're still going to get a look that looks like this, even if you've had to sew the squares together instead of picking up stitches along the edge. And if you want a tutorial video for how to do the mattress stitch, let me know in the comments and I'll be glad to create one of those soon. The last set of questions that I got really frequently tended to circle around the idea of whether I thought that all of this work was actually worth it and whether I would do it again, because it was a lot of work. I'm not going to lie to you. 214 hours worth of work is a lot of work. And it wasn't like I didn't have other things I was doing with my life, right? I was running a small business. I have my family. I have my community that I'm involved in. There's stuff going on, but this blanket was such a joy, and I do not regret a single minute of the time that I invested in it. I am really proud of how this blanket turned out. I will say this is not a quick project, right? This is a project where you are going to cast on and you're going to work on it for a little bit, and then you might set it aside, and then work on it for a bit and set it aside. Work on it for a bit and set it aside. You might even get mad at it and need to put it in timeout for a while. I reached a point where I was sick of looking at this blanket and did not touch it for months at a time. That's okay. That happens. For most of us, if we start a mitered square project, this is going to be an ongoing project that we're going to be working on a little bit at a time over an extended period of time. So give yourself grace. Don't feel like you have to rush. Unless you actually do have a deadline, don't give yourself a deadline if you don't need to. If that deadline's just going to stress you out, take your time with it, enjoy it. It's a really pleasant process. And eventually you get so into the rhythm of knitting mitered squares that you kind of fall in love with it. And now I've got several different mitered square projects that I'm contemplating in my head that I might start now that I have finished this blanket. Okay, that about covers all of the most common, frequently asked questions that I got about the Mitered Square Blanket of Doom. Again, if you have other questions that I didn't cover, feel free to ask them down in the comments below. I can either respond there or I can make a follow-up video if it turns out that there's a whole bunch of questions that I haven't managed to address in this video. Otherwise, thanks for being here. I look forward to seeing you again, and happy stitching.